here. Hey, all right, finally. All right, so we're now covering the American presidency. Hooray, the American presidency. And before I forget, keep in mind, of course, also that we have I'll make sure you can see this, midterm, but before we do the midterm, let's do the start attendance. So your numbers 366 is your attendance numbers. We go 366, and I go here, Zoom, back to Zoom, and 366, and go to chatting, and 366 like that. Okay, so then we can just close this and go back to the classroom. And just to remind you that on that, let me again share the screen, go to the assignments, and your midterm is due on first draft is due on Saturday. And I will then work on those over the weekend. And then I will also have more information about how we're going to do the conference sessions to discuss your midterm papers, and give you the choice of either coming to my office or doing it on Zoom. Even if you come to my office, we can have the conference sessions and record it so that I can make it available, a recording of it to you. But I think I'll leave that to you, but I'll have more to say about that later when I post the information on the website and with directions about how to sign up for the conference sessions to discuss my comments on the first draft of your midterm paper that is due on Saturday. And okay, so let's go back to the lesson plan for today. And or let's go to the notes, rather. Let's go to the notes. And let me see if I can just do this in the more normal way here. And okay, so executive branch, the presidency. So here we have a PowerPoint presentation on the presidency, and I think you can see that. And make sure, in case it's not being shared, that I do the share again. And so it states, and covering again the readings in the book, that the experience of the colonists with strong central government was negative because they had grown accustomed to being in charge of their own affairs, and the central authority was represented by the king, the crown, as the term is typically referred to, the crown, and the role of the crown, the British crown in American colonial history was pretty soft. I mean, of course, this is before there was electronic communication, so it wasn't possible to communicate with London and the government in London in order to decide issues. So the royal governor was appointed by the British Crown, but the royal governor had to make decisions and worked with the elected legislature. So that's an important point. These colonies had always had directly elected legislatures. And again, as the modern period began to develop further, and the central government in London became more and more concerned about exercising more control over the politics and economic resources of its North American colonies in competition with France, that the royal governor became a figure that was seen as representing this push by London to have more control over the colonies, particularly in the form of making the colonies pay more money in the form of taxes. Now, the taxes that the colonies were being pushed to pay for the cost of the British Army and British Navy in North America to counteract the French, who were still obviously in Quebec, and or still in much of, not in Quebec, but in the Western U.S., Western North America, I should say. It's not yet part of the U.S. until Thomas Jefferson becomes president and purchases the Louisiana French colony from Napoleon. That the taxes that London was putting on the colonies was not that much, but it was the mere fact that London was now telling the colonies, you are going to have to pay more money, and you really don't have the final say in whether or not this is acceptable. That was the source of anger and irritation, even though the level of the taxes, according to one source that I read, was not really was not high. But it was the point that the central government was attempting to enforce its will against people that had been governing their own affairs. Now, keep in mind, again, 40% of the population in North America at this time are enslaved people. So people who are concerned about controlling their own affairs included a large section of the ruling business and political elite, particularly in the southern colonies, that had built their economic interests and their political and cultural traditions on this notion of slavery. And of course, slavery was coming under challenge in Europe. So these slave owners are feeling more and more pressure from moral condemnation and challenging of slavery, that this isn't really a good idea, this notion of owning human beings as property. And so they're becoming more and more hostile and self-conscious of defending their interests, which they expressed in terms of local self-government. Like I said in previous classes, right? It's human nature for you and I to want to feel good about myself. I want to feel good about me. You want to feel good about you. And if I'm doing something and I've invested my economic interests and my hopes and dreams, my investments in the future in some kind of economic system, I'm probably going to want to defend that system unless I'm a highly unusual person. And there are lots of highly unusual people, I know that. But your typical person is, particularly if they are a product of and a beneficiary of this system of slavery, economic, political, and cultural beneficiary, they're going to try to explain and justify what they want in terms of more broadly appealing notions. So they would tend to argue, and they still to this day argue in terms of states' rights and local self-government, in keeping the central government from being too powerful and central government not overreaching and attempting to control the lives of people too closely. And you see that even today in 2022, that this hostility or suspicion about the growing role of the central government, particularly in 2022, up until the present, to enforce what we call human rights, that people should not be discriminated against on the basis of their race. And of course, as I mentioned, today, very few people will openly admit that they're racists in the United States. But when you point out to them that, well, Black people are 12% of the population, why are they 30% of the poverty-stricken people? Why are they 12% of the population, but they are 25% of the prison population? What is going on that is making these people become developing a marginal economic and political situation? Why is it that your typical white person inherits property, owns property or inherits property from their parents at 10 times the level of Black people? Like even Black people that have jobs that pay well, they have no savings. Like they didn't inherit anything from their grandparents or their great-grandparents or their parents. So like, for example, me, all of my brothers and sisters, we inherited money from my parents who died. So, and we inherited a significant amount of money because they worked hard and they invested. Black people don't have that. Why? And this makes people uncomfortable when you ask them why. They say, well, you say it's because Black people were purposely made less well-educated, were excluded from participating in politics through Jim Crow laws that we talked about previously. And you give them all this complicated explanation that implies that the government should act today to redress the legacies, the systemic reproduced legacies of marginalization and segregation, to break that cycle, to undertake what is called affirmative action programs on behalf of equal opportunity, equal employment opportunity, equal opportunity programs in general, through affirmative action to break the cycle of systemic marginalization and segregation of people on the basis of their identities as being Black. This makes people that benefit from the system or are comfortable with the system, people like me, even though my father was Italian, came from Europe, he is European. And this makes people, like many people in my position, uncomfortable. Like, I owe something to poor Black people? I should pay more taxes to help them? No, I didn't do anything to them. I didn't own slaves. Slavery ended 150 years ago. You're telling me that I can't become a college professor at that university because that university in the political science department wants to hire a Black person because we need more Black professors, so that Black professors or female professors or Asian professors should be employed by the political science department at Ohio State or University of Pittsburgh, so that they represent their students, because many of their students are Black, but 95% of college professors are white. What's going on there? And so you can say, well, that's good. That's a good idea. Oh, so Ben, sorry, you're not going to get the job. You have your hopes and dreams, Ben, of becoming a college professor. You're not going to get the job here because you're white. And this causes fury. And this is what Donald Trump plays with, and the Republican Party exploits to the present. They don't want to talk about critical race theory and systemic racism and white supremacy. They don't want to hear any of that, right? And they would rather believe that people are poor because they're lazy. People are poor because they don't work hard enough. People are poor maybe because their parents were bad, and that's a fact that you should, it's not my fault that your family, your parents were bad people. And so this becomes very emotional, very sensitive. And so this goes back to this strong suspicion of the power of the central government, going not only, but heavily influenced by this concern that the central government was going to try to change and abolish the political economy of early modern America that was based on slavery. And not just on slavery, also taking the land and resources from the indigenous population that was already living in the territory, pushing them out, taking their territory and exploiting it to make money. And and of course, during the American Independence War, the British king did attempt to appeal to the Black people to rise up against the Americans who were fighting the British, promising that if the British won the war against the American revolutionaries, they would end slavery. And this infuriated so many white Americans. And of course, the British still lost the war. And so states' rights, the rights of the American states versus the central government remains to this day a powerful form of rhetoric that is used to justify certain political positions that many people claim is a code, maybe not even a conscious code, but an implicit code that goes back to the founding of America on slavery and the desire of white slave owners to be left alone to do what they want to do with their property, which were enslaved people, and viewing the central state, the federal government, as a source of danger. So going on here with fighting the war against the British required that these 13 colonies cooperate. There were 13 separate colonies, and so they had to form a continental body to organize their efforts to fight the mighty British Empire. And that led to the establishment of the Continental Congress. And there really wasn't a strong central government under the Continental Congress. It was sufficient to be able to mobilize enough resources with the help of the French. The French played a big role in helping the Americans defeat the British, a critical role. I don't know if the Americans would have succeeded. According to one source I read, the French kingdom, the French Empire, provided almost all the gunpowder for the Americans that they used in that war against the British. Can you imagine that? and that the French Navy blockaded and prevented the British Navy from supplying the British Army at the end of the war at a special time because the British were preoccupied with some other, British Navy was preoccupied with other conflicts. And and even at the last battle of Yorktown, almost 50% of the soldiers fighting that defeated the British General Cornwallis, the last big battle of the Independence War at Yorktown, almost half were French soldiers. So, and this is also an important point, and I think I might have mentioned this before, and it would be relevant today too, that the Americans like to believe that they're somehow special and separate from the rest of the world, particularly Europe, that the European affairs and European conflicts, that's a separate world that America should stay out of. And George Washington, the first president of the United States, when he was leaving, saying farewell after leaving the office of president after 2 terms, choosing not to be reelected, only being reelected once, he gave his farewell address. And in his farewell address, he said, stay out of European affairs. But European affairs were always critical in explaining the development of the United States. It was because of the British competition with the French and the French hostility to the British that the French intervened and helped the Americans defeat the British, to defeat British power after the British defeated them in the middle of the 18th century and took Quebec and Montreal from the French Empire. And then, as I mentioned, early in the 18th century, early in the 19th century, Thomas Jefferson, the second president who became president after George Washington, he was able to buy the remaining French colonies in North America from Napoleon after the French Revolution had occurred, partly because of the terrible, tremendous debts of the French government that included the cost of the French government in paying for their war in North America against the British to help the Americans succeed. It added greatly to the French government deficits. And so the French Revolution happened. Napoleon was concentrating on conquering Europe, and then also focusing on maybe trying to invade England. Napoleon lost control over Haiti. Haiti was a very prosperous colony because it grows sugarcane, and sugar was a very valuable commodity. And the Haitian Revolution occurred, and they overthrew the French army, and Napoleon was not able to conquer Haiti because of the disease, the yellow fever, and the resistance. And when he lost Haiti, his desire to hold on to Louisiana, the central part of North America, I don't really want to spend the time looking for a map of right now. He decided to sell Louisiana to the new American Republic, to Thomas Jefferson and the Americans, to raise money for his wars in Europe, and also to make sure that the British don't conquer it and take that territory from the French and add it to the British Empire. So again, because of international conflict, European conflict, again, the American Republic is strongly shaped by these events, beginning the expansion of America beyond the Mississippi River out all the way out the Pacific Ocean. And this is relevant to your reading today, this week, about the American presidency, because the American presidency is this very powerful office, overwhelmingly powerful office today because of international conflict, the Cold War. The American presidency became very powerful and strong at various times, but particularly during times of war. So during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States, and he had tremendous power that he used to abolish slavery in the name of his power as the leader of the American military, that abolishing slavery was necessary to win the war, to deplete the resources of the South that relied upon slavery for labor. So he declared the end of slavery, and he justified it in his role as commander-in-chief of the military. And the Constitution in Article 2 defines the president as the commander-in-chief, and through the executive order of Abraham Lincoln as commander-in-chief, he ended slavery in the Emancipation Proclamation in his capacity as commander-in-chief to win the war. The Congress did not succeed in abolishing slavery. The US Congress voted during the war, when the Civil War was happening, and could not, even during the time of the war, vote to abolish slavery. So he did it as president. And he did other things as well, like he suspended the right to a fair trial, to be arrested as a suspected treasonous agent serving the enemy. He suspended what's called habeas corpus, that if you're going to be arrested and you have to be charged with a crime, and a judge has to evaluate the evidence and decide that, yeah, there's significant evidence here to warrant charging you with a crime and arresting you because there's a lot of evidence against you. And the Latin term for that process is called habeas corpus, that there has to be evidence of a crime before a judge has to agree exists that's sufficient for the judge to issue a writ of habeas corpus to arrest somebody and put them in jail. Yep, and then prepare for a trial. And he suspended that during the war, Abraham Lincoln. Then Abraham Lincoln was killed, and very quickly the American president became very, very weak. I mean, most Americans couldn't even tell you who were the presidents from Abraham Lincoln until the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, did you know? I mean, how many Americans do you think know that we had presidents like Chester Arthur and Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison? I mean, these were all late 19th century presidents. Presidents were very weak in this time of economic expansion. The Americans were focused on expanding out to Pacific Ocean. They faced resistance from local indigenous Indian tribes, but that was very weak and those tribes had very little power capability, right? It's not like it required tremendous American resources to mobilize the military to fight India. No, it's not like fighting France or fighting Britain or fighting Germany or preparing to fight the Soviet Union, or today trying to prepare to fight Russia. It was very minor demands on American resources. And it's interesting. I've used the editions of this book previously, and they took this point out. But back in 2006, when I used this book in another class, Sabato pointed out that William McKinley was the president at the end of the 19th century during the Spanish-American War, when America would take Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam from Spain. And they still have Guam, and Puerto Rico is a territory, and the Philippines is heavily influenced by American culture. But that William McKinley, he had 11 people that worked for him in his office that worked directly for the president. Just 11 people. And William McKinley, who was from my home state, in my hometown in Ohio, Canton, Ohio, he was the last president of the United States that was a Civil War veteran. And he would come to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he would go home and finish at 5 in the afternoon. Now, soon, though, this begins to change. The U.S. Office of the Presidency becomes more and more important, partly because of the Spanish-American War, and then the push to reform American society under the progressive movement that emerged to try to reduce corruption in American politics, begin to address these Jim Crow laws that had become institutionalized, the lynching and killing going on against Black people that was done spontaneously, but hundreds of people, even I saw one estimate that 5,000 Black people were killed in extrajudicial murders, or what they call lynchings, from 1880 until 1930. And then the expansion during the First World War would play an important role in this. But after World War I, again, American presidents became less important or significant, but it's during World War II, and particularly during the Cold War, that we see American presidents and the offices that they lead come to become a huge part of the U.S. government, and American presidents becoming the dominant political figures that they are in the American political system to this day. So, but back to the founding of the American Constitution. it established that the president must be a natural born citizen, because under European monarchies, it was quite common well, not, I mean, it was common practice for the kings of European kingdoms and principalities to be the sons and daughters and nephews of related houses, even though they were not born or raised in the place where they became the king. And this was seen as a source of danger to American democracy. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is the former governor of California and the Terminator movie star, he could never become president of the United States because he was not born in the United States. He became an American citizen, but he cannot be president because he was not born in the US. He could become a senator, he can become a congressman. He was the governor of California, but he could not become president. And so, again, some basic information that, again, these people that are writing the US Constitution, as we said, the fastest way of communicating was by boat. And so people that were diplomats, they might be serving abroad for many, many years. So, of course, they're part of the political elite. So the point was established that these people must be resident of the US for at least 14 years. Even if they were born in the United States, they have to live and experience life in the United States for at least 14 years of their life, rather than serving in the diplomatic corps, in Paris or London for an extended period of most of their lives. And the tradition, the choice was made in negotiations that the president can be reelected for 4-year terms, and only in 1951 was the Constitution amended to limit formally the term of president to 2 elected terms. So, and this was after Franklin Roosevelt was elected 4 times. The president from 1932, or he won election in 1932 until he died in office in, I think it was 1944. He died in office soon after he was elected the 4th time. And but previously just been a tradition that Washington set that a president should be only in office for 2 4-year terms. It was just a custom, and then it was established as a principle in 1951 after the experience with Roosevelt. And so I guess I don't need to go through this here, the list of the US presidents. Impeachment. You saw in the video I was showing you how Bill Clinton was the first president to be impeached since Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was the vice president who became president when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The first president to be assassinated was Abraham Lincoln, and Andrew Johnson became president. And it's been an issue since then because typically the person that becomes vice president is chosen to help the election outcomes on behalf of the person who's running for president. So the person that is chosen typically to be vice president is not chosen because they're not chosen because they're considered to be wise, effective leaders. They're chosen because it will help Abraham Lincoln win the election to become president. They're chosen because they'll help Joe Biden get elected in 2020, and defeat Donald Trump. Of course, they deny that that's true, but Kamala Harris is vice president because she's helped Joe Biden win the election against Donald Trump. And that's maybe not the only reason why Joe Biden chose her to be his running mate in the 2020 election, but it was the most important consideration, that Donald Trump must be defeated. Kamala Harris can appeal to the younger, non-white section of American society in particular, and female, as more and more, by the end of this decade, the population will be half non-white by the end of, by 2030. She's young. She's also Asian American and Black American and a woman, and not too old, not as old as Joe Biden. She's younger than me by several years. So that will help Joe Biden, an old white man, get elected. And it worked. And but Andrew Johnson was chosen to be the running mate of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 because Andrew Johnson would appeal to those white people that were sympathetic to the Southern slave owners, but did not support secession, leaving the United States and forming the Confederacy. So Andrew Johnson was a Tennessee politician. He was hostile to the effort to break up the United States, but he defended slavery. And so Abraham Lincoln is murdered at the height of his appeal, and Andrew Johnson becomes president. And he was very sympathetic to the Southerners, and he began moving to restrict the efforts to enforce civil rights on Black people, for Black people in the South. And he very quickly became an enemy of the Republican Party dominating the Congress. And the Congress found a reason or a particular issue of dispute to impeach Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was put on trial after the House of Representatives passed the articles of impeachment regarding some dismissal or dispute regarding some official in the cabinet, I think, but it really was due to a deep sense of unhappiness with this person who was preventing serious, far-reaching change in the South, despite hundreds of thousands of dead people from the war. And he was put on trial, and they impeached and put on trial, and they failed to find him guilty by one vote, the 2/3 majority necessary. They were one vote short in the Senate of finding him guilty and removing him from office. And he did not run for re-election. He did not run for election after that experience because he knew he was not going to win. And then this comes up again later when John F. Kennedy is assassinated. I mean, Benjamin Harrison had been killed. William McKinley was killed in office as well, assassinated. And then John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. And he was replaced by Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson was a powerful Texas Democratic politician. He had been a senator. He had a great reputation of being able to get legislation and bills through the Congress. And he was chosen to be John Fitzgerald Kennedy's running mate in 1960 to help win conservative white voters for John F. Kennedy, who was the first Catholic president of the United States. There was still a lot of suspicion in America towards the Catholic and the Catholic Church. John F. Kennedy, when he was running for president, had to promise that he was not going to take orders from the Pope. When the Pope were to call him on the phone and say, "Hey, Catholic John F. Kennedy, I want you to," that he promised he would not listen to the Pope if the Pope had certain preferences. And Lyndon Johnson was chosen as his running mate as a white Southern politician. And John F. Kennedy barely won the election in 1960 against Richard Nixon. And there's some dispute about whether or not it was fair, whether or not there wasn't some corruption involved in Chicago and Illinois and West Virginia. And he barely beat Richard Nixon. And then John F. Kennedy, he's the young president, the youngest president ever. He's in his mid-40s. It's like Barack Obama. He's married to this beautiful wife who's a socialite, Jacqueline Kennedy, and then he gets killed, and Lyndon Johnson becomes president, and Lyndon Johnson uses the sympathy and outpouring of grief for John F. Kennedy and his programs because he was promoting civil rights and the legislation to end Jim Crow, but he couldn't get it through the Congress. But then he gets killed, and then the Cold War is going on, right? And the Soviet Union is saying, look at how those Americans treat their Black people. See Africa, see Asia, see what capitalist America does to its Black people. You shouldn't like America's system. You should adopt the Soviet communist model. Yeah. And the Americans are really concerned about the Soviet Union, believing that it's a Russian version of Nazi Germany, but with a more appealing ideology of socialism. And the Soviet Union is telling the Africans and Asians of the newly independent countries that broke away from British racist and French racist imperialism that they should follow the Soviet model. And also the the strong demands from social activists and civil rights activists that have been pushing for decades, but had been delayed because of the Second World War from having enough impact, and then the Cold War from having enough impact, that Lyndon Johnson decides that that he needs to push for this policy. And then the Republican Party chooses in 1964, Barry Goldwater to be the Republican candidate for president. And Barry Goldwater is a militant Cold Warrior. He's considered to be crazy, dangerous by the opponents of the Republicans in Barry Goldwater. And I think I showed you that. Did I show you that famous? Maybe I showed it in the previous class. I sort of mix up the classes over the semesters. But this is the notorious campaign commercial that Lyndon Johnson used in the 1964 election. He's running for president after completing John F. Kennedy's term. He's running for president in 1964. And this is the famous. What is that? And where's the sound? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So he succeeded in portraying Barry Goldwater as crazy, much like how some people would claim that, and there you see Barry Goldwater. And the Democratic Party, again, this is after John F. Kennedy's murdered just a year earlier. The Democratic Party under Lyndon Johnson and his election campaign for president also wins big majorities in the Senate and the House of Representatives and the Congress. And of course, Lyndon Johnson wins in a landslide as president, claiming that this man is crazy. He's going to start World War III against the Soviet Union. Oh my God. And he only wins, this person, the only states he wins are the American Southern states that for 100 years had voted only for Democrats because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. But now they all vote for him, a Republican, because he is appealing to their desire to prevent the federal government from intervening in Southern affairs to protect civil rights of Black people. That began after World War II under Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman, who was president during the Korean War, he began to push legislation and efforts to stop Jim Crow in the South. And the only states he wins are those Southern states. And the Republican Party would then move to become the dominant actor in the South since the 1960s because of the civil rights legislation that he passed as president. And of course, he is known not only for the civil rights legislation he adopted, but also making the determination that he was going to send the US military hundreds of thousands of soldiers to go fight in Vietnam and lose. So at the same time that he's pushing for this civil rights legislation with these tremendous majorities for the Democrats in the Senate and the House, he's also getting us deeper and deeper, the Americans deeper and deeper involved in this quagmire in the Vietnam War. And this is all happening during the Cold War. And so the American president becomes this powerful actor, not only because of the Cold War, not only because of the Vietnam War, but also because the American economy is also developing. The American modern industrialized economy requires national regulation, national monitoring, and the states governments are not sufficient or able to run a modern economy. So that becomes the part of the context that the American executive branch grows tremendously in the development of the modern American economy and the development of the modern American state. So make sure that you're able to see this, go back to the PowerPoint slides. And so impeachment is very rarely ever used. It's not used again until Bill Clinton is impeached for supposedly lying under oath about whether or not he had sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. And he did, but he just blatantly lied under oath when he was being investigated about various types of issues. They also asked him, the investigators, about whether or not he had ever had sexual relations with one of his interns working in his office, and he denied it, but he did. And so that, of course, was the first time we have had an actual impeachment of American president since Andrew Johnson. So that's 130 years after Andrew Johnson. And it was good television. I remember watching CNN live coverage of the trial in the Senate of Bill Clinton. And it was all entertaining in the sense that there are other problems confronting the United States were not major. The economy was doing really well under the Clinton administration. The longest period of sustained economic growth since modern record keeping began. The only war that the US was involved was when Clinton ordered the US NATO to bomb Serbia over Kosovo and the Albanian population. And you're on ice, right? Are you from? Oh, okay. I was just thinking, Anais Moose is also in this class, I think. She's from Switzerland. The Albanian population, I guess, is very significant in Switzerland, and they are sending money and fighters to help the Albanians in Kosovo fight against the Serbs, as well as volunteering to fight for the Kosovo Liberation Army. This is in 1999. And just like lots of Ukrainians are going now to Ukraine and sending money and to Ukraine, as well as volunteering and going back to Ukraine to fight in Ukraine. But the U.S. bombs Serbia. They suffer no casualties because all they do is drop bombs from high in the sky. The Serbs can't shoot them down, and the Serbs withdraw from Kosovo, and so it looks like a victory for the United States. And Americans like victories. And so Bill Clinton impeachment was sort of like reality television. But of course, then Donald Trump gets elected in 2016, as I already mentioned earlier. This PowerPoint slide was prepared in 2006. So this is 8 years after the Lewinsky impeachment of Clinton. And so that's the context. But of course, this is 10 years before Donald Trump is elected. And he's impeached twice, including for pressuring the Ukrainian government under Zelensky, the new president of Ukraine, to falsify evidence claiming that Joe Biden's family was involved in corrupt activity in Ukraine, and then also for attempting to overthrow the election results in January of last year, in January 6th, 2001. And so we've had 2 more impeachments, and meaning that we're going to have more of these. They've happened twice in the last few years, and they're going to happen 3 times over the last 15 years, and that means we're probably going to have more of them. And even though when I was a child, impeachment was this. We talked about under Richard Nixon, but Richard Nixon resigned before he could be impeached and put on trial, and he would have been found guilty, which is why he resigned. The Clinton trial, the vote was 50 to convict, 50 not to convict. So out of 100 senators, it was 50%. You need 2/3, 67% to vote to convict. And yeah, so the vice presidents, again, Ronald Reagan was shot and nearly killed in the early 1980s. And, but since that time, really, vice presidents have continued to be kind of a weak actors in the American political system. And except insofar as they maybe are identified as future candidates for president. So Bill Clinton's vice president was Al Gore, and Al Gore had run for president more than once previously before becoming Bill Clinton's running mate as vice president, the senator from Tennessee. And then he lost to George W. Bush in 2000. And George W. Bush selected someone to be his vice president that was very important, Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney had been a powerful Republican Party official. And George Bush decided to give Dick Cheney predominant authority over American national security policy because of Dick Cheney's role in the Cold War. That Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and these Cold Warriors, they had lots of influence over the military, security, and economic industries that won the Cold War and supposedly saved the world from the Russian version of Nazi Germany under American leadership. And so that's the dominant view of his daughter, Liz Cheney. Dick Cheney's still alive. Liz Cheney is the one congressman from the Cheney's home state of Wyoming. Only like 600,000 people live there. And she is one of the few Republicans that continues to resist Donald Trump. Donald Trump is trying to get her defeated in November when there will be elections for Congress. And he claims that Liz Cheney, like her father, advocates American military expansion around the world and spending lots of money on American military operations and around the world that waste lots of money, and that money should be kept in the United States and spent for Americans, not in wars. So he criticizes her as a warmonger, Liz Cheney. But she's one of the few Republicans that is directly opposing Donald Trump. And then the vice president that was chosen to be the running mate for Joe Biden, as told you, is Kamala Harris, the former new young senator from California, who and was chosen to make sure that Donald Trump was defeated. That was the overriding imperative, that Donald Trump is a fascist in this view, and that the first thing to do was get him out. And so, but of course, Joe Biden is 79 years old. COVID is rampaging throughout the world. Lots of people around Joe Biden have had the virus. Now, Joe Biden has been vaccinated and boosted twice. So sure, but he's 79. So there's some concern that, particularly with COVID-19, that she might actually have to be president, or that maybe Joe Biden will choose not to run for re-election in 2022 because he's too old. Now, he's indicated or said he's going to run for re-election, but maybe something will happen between now and then. And if he doesn't run for re-election, Kamala Harris has been the vice president. She's been criticized as not being very effective in organizing her office, that there's lots of conflict among her administrators that work for her, that she's not effective in choosing people that can cooperate with each other and giving them direction. Those are the grumblings that come out. Joe Biden gives her lots of heavy responsibilities. This 52 or 3-year-old woman who was only a senator for 2 or 3 years from California, she's been given the responsibility for dealing with immigration, illegal immigration from Latin America, from Mexico and Central America, and other heavy tasks. And some people wonder if Joe Biden really is setting her up to fail, because who's going to solve immigration into the United States? And so through 2005, 8 presidents have died in office. And I guess in 1947, Congress decided to pass the Presidential Succession Act. This is because when Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in office, he had a massive stroke. He was replaced by Harry S. Truman, and Harry S. Truman became president, and there was no vice president. Harry S. Truman was just president, and he had no vice president because that wasn't in the Constitution. Well, what do you do with the office of vice president when the vice president becomes the president? And so this was passed in 1947 to lay out who would replace, Harry S. Truman if he died or could no longer serve as president. And but that's not really so important. What's more important is the 25th Amendment. This came up during the Trump administration. This was adopted to as an amendment to lay out how you would go about replacing the vice president when the vice president becomes the president. And this was passed in 1967 under Lyndon Johnson. And who did Lyndon Johnson? Lyndon Johnson also did not have a vice president while he was president. He, from 1963 until 1965, when he was sworn in as president, he did not have a vice president. So in 1964, he selected Hubert Humphrey, a senator from Minnesota, to be his running mate. And Hubert Humphrey was the vice president from 1965 until 1968. But in 1967, the 25th Amendment was passed that explained how the vice president would be elected, and then this would be chosen to replace the vice president becomes president. And then this is used in 1974 for the first time. I remember when this happened, right? That Spiro Agnew was the former governor of Maryland who ran for vice president with Richard Nixon in 1968, and he is elected vice president in 1968. I think, Greek background, Spiro is a Greek name, and Spiro Agnew, governor of Maryland. And then he resigned before Nixon resigned because of corruption charges. And then and this, of course, is when Watergate is going on, the Watergate scandal. The investigation is underway. And then Richard Nixon chooses Gerald R. Ford to be his vice president according to this procedure, which means he chooses someone to be his vice president, and then that person is confirmed by simple majority vote in the House and the Senate. And then Nixon resigns in 1974, and Gerald R. Ford becomes president and pardons Richard Nixon for any crimes he may have committed. He did or may be charged with having committed any crimes he committed as president, he's pardoned. And so, of course, there's been lots of discussion or speculation that there was a deal made between Nixon and Ford, that Nixon chose him to be vice president in turn for Nixon then resigning and Ford pardoning him. And of course, Ford denies it. Ford denied it. Ford said when he became president after Nixon resigned, 2/3 of his day was spent dealing with Nixon issues, investigating Nixon, discussing Nixon, and he wanted to remove that to deal with the other problems like the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union, China, the economy. But he ran for election to be president in 1976, and Jimmy Carter won and beat him. And the claim is that Gerald R. Ford may have lost because of so many Americans were upset or outraged that Ford had pardoned Nixon. And then Gerald R. Ford chooses Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president according to this procedure. Now, this also contains a procedure for removing a president as president if the person who's president is incapacitated. So let's say Joe Biden has a massive stroke. He's 79 years old. He has a stroke. He doesn't die, but he's comatose. He's in the hospital. His brain is gone, but he's not technically dead. What do? And this 25th Amendment lays out a procedure by which the vice president and the cabinet, the Secretary of Defense, State, Agriculture, they all get together and declare that the president is incapacitated and the vice president is now the president. The idea was, what do you do with somebody who's sick but not dead? How do you get rid of them? And this was supposed to be for that kind of contingency. And then the Congress then votes to confirm that the president is incapacitated, is no longer the president, through a simple majority vote. This came up in dealing with Trump, that many observers were really afraid of what Trump was doing. That Trump, like Barry Goldwater, he's crazy. He's going to start World War III. Oh my gosh, there's something wrong with him. And there was discussion in the media about invoking the 25th Amendment to remove Donald Trump. And of course, it never happened. But there was discussion about using this procedure for declaring a president to be incapacitated as a way to get rid of that person. Because unlike in Germany or unlike in Britain, the ruling party in Britain can get rid of the prime minister if the prime minister is doing a bad job, if the prime minister is considered to be a real problem, like Margaret Thatcher. She was removed as prime minister without an election in 1991, I believe, because she was seen as for a number of reasons, including she was too anti-European Union. And so she was removed by the Conservative Party meeting, and the top officials voted against her to no longer be leader of the Conservative Party. And since she was no longer leader of the Conservative Party, she no longer controlled the parliament, because the party that controls the parliament elects the prime minister. They choose the prime minister on the basis of which parties control the parliament, the House of Commons. Since she was no longer leader of the Conservative Party, she could no longer be prime minister. And so she was removed as prime minister without an election. And so how do you get rid of a president without an election? You can either impeach them, or you can maybe invoke this. And if you elect a crazy person or a sick person, how do you get rid of them? Impeachment? Impeachment is really hard to do. Donald Trump was impeached twice, and they never even came close to two-thirds majority vote to remove from office. Okay, so all right, so we should cover some of the powers of the US president. The president appoints 3,500 more or less top officials in the US government. That's a lot. About half of those have to be approved by the Senate. The president can call emergency sessions of the Congress. The president has the power to make treaties. And again, the president is commander in chief of the military. And during the Cold War, that was the view, that the Soviet Union is a Russian version of Nazi Germany. Think about that. The Soviet Union has nuclear weapons. Imagine if Adolf Hitler and Germany had nuclear weapons. Okay, of course, the Americans got them first, but the Americans believed that the Soviet Union was trying to conquer the world using socialism and communism as broadly appealing manipulation of symbols to appeal to the poor, downtrodden, former colonial countries of the world that had been suffering under French or Chinese or Japanese or British or Spanish or Portuguese imperialism in Africa and Asia. But of course, the Soviet Union doesn't want to commit suicide by having a war with the United States, because it would be a nuclear war. So the Soviet Union, in this worldview of the Soviet Union as a diabolical enemy trying to conquer the world, is seen as carrying out its conspiratorial efforts hidden and blocked through the secret police, the secret intelligence services of the Soviet Union, the KGB, to spread communism and carry out coups and use its minions and henchmen like supposedly Kim Il-sung in North Korea, and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and Fidel Castro in Cuba, and all of these other leftist figures are either working for Stalin and Moscow or are fools who are being used and manipulated by radical communist forces taking orders ultimately from Moscow. So the United States president needs to have the full responsibility and capability and resources to be able to act in every part of the world where the communists are carrying out their evil plans, their evil conspiratorial plans to take power without directly invading the country the way Hitler did. Right? That the Soviet Union, they're not like the Nazis. They're not gangsters in a hurry. That's how the German leadership was characterized, that they're gangsters in a hurry. But no. The Soviets will work with their spies and agents and collaborators to spread communism. So the US president was given all of these powers under the commander-in-chief clause to direct the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, all of the vast intelligence agencies, and the Pentagon to intervene wherever the communists are attempting to spread their influence and their empire. Without having to go through the US Congress to get a declaration of war, like Harry S. Truman. He sent the US military to fight in Korea without asking the Congress. Because if you wait to ask the Congress, it's too late. Right? Stalin doesn't have to wait to ask anybody if he wants to send his military to invade another country, order Kim Il-sung, take South Korea. He can just do it. So we have to give all this power to the US president. The US president also can use nuclear weapons because the Soviet Union might attempt to carry out a Pearl Harbor type nuclear attack against the United States and obliterate the United States before the Americans can respond. So the US president has to have the ability to use nuclear weapons if necessary to stop the Soviet Union as a Russian version, a nuclear armed Russian version of Nazi Germany. And so, and then, of course, the pardoning power. That is a power. Donald Trump pardoned many people when he was leaving office, including many people that would have been charged, that were charged or would have been charged with crimes involving Trump's efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Okay, so maybe let's do an exercise at this point. So let's do an exercise on the executive branch. And so let me go to the executive branch of the US government and send you all a form and a file. So let's go to chatting and we go to file here. And let me send you, if I can find it here, my USB. You can go to US government and send you this file. Sorry. Here. And, executive branch. Here you go here. Open. And so please open that file and let me open the file as well. And okay. And see if you can view this. And, this is the file I just sent you about the very big branch of the US Congress, of the US executive branch, I'm sorry, of the presidency that became very big during the 20th century. And so there's just basic discussion about the role of the executive branch. And so please open that file so you can go along. And of course, the job of the executive branch is to execute the laws of the US government passed by the Congress. And when you think about executive branch, you think about the president. But of course, the president is the chief executive officer of a set of organizations, including departments, not ministries like you have in France or ministries like you have in Korea. They were called departments. And departments are the main organizations in the executive branch. And there are 15 departments. Each department is led by a cabinet secretary. So there are 15 cabinet secretaries. Each one focused on a specific type of activity, such as education, transportation, defense, or energy. Each department has smaller agencies that do specific jobs. For example, the Department of Justice operates our justice system and works to prevent crime. And two agencies inside the Department of Justice are the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the Drug Enforcement Agency. The FBI investigates certain kinds of crimes, while the DEA deals with crime related to drugs and controlled substances. Losing my place here. The president appoints a secretary to lead each department. Of course, the Senate has to approve each appointment. But the head of the Department of Justice is called the Attorney General, not a secretary. Those secretaries do more than just lead a department. They are the president's cabinet, a group of people that give advice to help the president make important decisions. Officials who hold these cabinet-level positions, such as the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Education. Oh, can you see that? I got to make sure you're able to see that. Close that. All right. Officials who hold these cabinet-level positions, such as the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Education, or the Secretary of Homeland Security, are very important players in the executive branch. And so there are also independent agencies, are government organizations that focus on specific issues, but they are different from departments because they are independent of the president's control. Instead, these agencies are controlled by a board or commission. The president can appoint someone to the board or commission, but cannot remove them. So again, these are mostly the products of the 20th century, and the war fighting and dealing with the challenges of national security play a very important role. The Department of Agriculture was founded during the Civil War under the Lincoln administration in order to organize US farming resources to supply the armies fighting the Civil War, and again, to show the impact of the of war fighting. So the Constitution does explicitly describe certain agencies and certain departments, I should say, but it does not describe all of them. The Department of Agriculture is not described in the U.S. Constitution. The Department of Homeland Security is not described in the Constitution. Departments change their names as well. The Department of Defense used to be called the War Department during World War II, up through World War II, the War Department. They carry out the laws that are involved in managing a highly complex, vast, modern economy and in regulating that economy. You cannot have a modern, successful, developed economy unless you have strong enforcement of law capability of your government. And that's the problem of corruption, right? That you cannot have the rule of law if people believe that government officials in these agencies can be bribed. And rightly or wrongly, Americans tend to believe that the people that represent the government do represent the legal authority of the United States. But in places like Bulgaria or Ukraine or Russia, corruption is a terrible, terrible problem. And so, or not even those former communist countries, Greece, right? That people tend to believe, rightly or wrongly, that if somebody is in government, that they are corrupt. And changing that mindset is very challenging, and actually is part of what development means. Making people believe or persuading people that the rule of law predominates in South Korea or France or United States or Japan. And money and bribery. Carrying out laws, regulations, again, Congress passes laws, but these regulations, they often have to be written and specified because the Congress passes thousands and thousands of pages of new laws every year. But still, you can imagine in a modern economy of a developed country, there's no way the Congress can foresee every challenge of actually implementing these laws. So these agencies, they do much of the work of actually putting in the detail in these laws that are passed by the South Korean Assembly or the French National Assembly or the American Congress. And there's procedures for that that are also described in the United States law, that an agency will, looking at the Congress legislation, have to apply that legislation to the specific situations and circumstances that Congress did not address or could not address from a law that was passed 50, 60 years ago. Like, for example, what's a lot in the news these days? The environmental movement in the United States succeeded in pushing Richard Nixon, the Republican president, established the Environmental Protection Agency, which became something like an agency for all the other countries in the world on how you create a government agency to try to monitor and protect and improve the environment and stop pollution. And the Environmental Protection Agency laws were adopted 50 years ago. So how do you deal with climate change? Climate change wasn't a serious issue 50 years ago. So the agency and the people working within it, the civil servants working within these agencies, have had to reinterpret that Environmental Protection Agency law to apply it to climate change and carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. So the Environmental Protection Agency decided that, guess what? Carbon dioxide, that's also pollution. That wasn't considered pollution 60 years ago, 50 years ago. Not carbon dioxide, like what you breathe, what I breathe out of my body, that's carbon dioxide. That was not considered pollution. Now it is considered pollution. And that is because of the interpretation of these agencies. These agencies are often sued by special interest groups like coal companies, oil companies, gas companies, saying, hey, this legislation was not meant to cover carbon dioxide. And often they are sued in courts, in federal courts, and then the federal courts have to make a decision about whether or not the regulations that these agencies wrote in great detail are constitutional or not. So previously, before I came here, so like 12 or 13 years ago, the US Supreme Court did rule that carbon dioxide is pollution. And so the Environmental Protection Agency can act to regulate greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. But that's being challenged again because we have new people on the US Supreme Court. And so the point is that Congress, they pass lots of laws. The French Assembly passes laws. The South Korean Assembly passes laws. But these people that work in these agencies, these are the experts. These are the people that deal with the details of actually enforcing laws, that know the specific situations of their local communities in the very diverse United States, or the diverse France, or the diverse Korea. And so these people actually do a lot of the real substantive issues of lawmaking, as well as law executing, law implementing. They maintain order and security. And again, the Department of Homeland Security was created after the September 11, 2001 attacks. And the Federal Emergency Management Agency has been around for a long time, but with the worsening climate crisis and more natural disasters, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has become more and more active and more important. The Defense Department became a huge bureaucracy during the Cold War, and it continues to grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger 30 years after the Cold War ended. After the Soviet Union disintegrated, there was some talk about reducing the size of the Defense Department, but that discussion and talk about reducing the size of the Defense Department decreased after the United States bombed Serbia and then disappeared after the September 11, 2001 attacks, 2 years after the Kosovo War. So let me pass to you another file. Chatting. Find this. So here is another file. So let me open up that file. First, let me open it up on my computer. And again, it always makes this kind of, okay, so close that. So those of you who, I don't know if it's the same in French or in Korean, but people that work in government agencies, including the US government, but also like the United Nations or the European Union, they use acronyms. Acronyms are words created out of the first letters of words. I don't know if they do that so much in France. They probably do, or in Korea, but people will often talk about the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. So they won't say the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They'll say FEMA did that. FEMA needs this. We need to have FEMA focus more on flooding. FEMA needs to focus more on forest fires and wildfires because of droughts and so on. The EPA, the DOJ, the FBI, the AG, the Attorney General, the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, the DOD, people that work in Washington, they all use these acronyms. And it's true also in the United Nations, in the European Union, and in NATO, that if you become part of that professional environment, you almost begin to speak a separate language because you're always using acronyms. And CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, Veteran Affairs Department, Health and Human Services, Department of Energy, Department of Education, Housing and Urban Development. And so go back to the chatting and go to 5, open that. So let you open up that file and go to chapter 4 and 5 here. And so again, I have to mess with this, go to view. So there you can see ask exercise. Oh, right. So how about how many people do we have here today? We've got 7 people. So if we break you up into 2 groups, let's have the first group do this set of exercises, and the second group do this set of exercises. So group 1 will do A. Okay, let's do like this. Let's go into 3 groups. So group 1 will do exercise A. Group 2 will do exercise. Well, 4 groups. Okay, 4 groups. So there's 4 ABC. Group 1 will do exercise A. Group 2 will do exercise B. Group 3 will do exercise C. And group 4 will do exercise D. So let me automatically assign you to these groups. And breakout rooms. I think this is breakout rooms. This one? Okay, thank you. So we'll assign you to 4 groups. And let me rename. This is A. This is B. This is C. And this is D. So please join those groups. A, B, C, and D. Please join those groups. And I don't know what that is here. and Micah and Yi Ju Young. And so you will do exercise, group A will do exercise A, group B will do exercise B, group C will do exercise C, and group D will do exercise D. So please work with each other. Choose the top person in each group will speak for each group. The first person in each group will speak for each group. And let's just do that very quickly and let you do that for a minute or two. And we will complete the form in class, okay? So go back to the file. A will do this exercise, group B will do this exercise, group C will do this exercise, and group D will do this exercise. Okay? And I think while you're doing that, I'm going to set up my laptop because I'm going to have to close this computer. Okay. So Jean is going to speak for D, Chung Du Jin will speak for C, Mike will speak for B, and Juliet will speak for A. And